There we go.
Here we are. So, Manda Scott, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very honored to have you here.
It's a great honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to talk to you again. I so
Yeah.
enjoy your digital company.
Oh,
So thank you.
likewise, likewise. I feel like we are walking alongside in all kinds of
Yeah.
scapes and dimensions. So it's kind of fun to be in the Zoomscape and see what happens. And as you know, we chatted a bit beforehand. There's all kinds of places we could go, but maybe we'll just start kind of simple. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself. Who are you, and what are you up to?
I'm Manda Scott. So we got to know each other because I host the Accidental Gods podcast. And last year I set up something called the Thrutopia Masterclass because I am also a novelist. And after decades, 3 decades of writing novels that were in some way embedded in the current paradigm, I woke up to the fact that we actually need fiction that will walk us forward from exactly where we are to a future we would actually want. And my goodness, why did it take me so long? But anyway, the masterclass was an attempt to bring other writers into that awareness and to give them the information, having realized that and started a novel, which I had an editorial meeting on Friday. Um, I realized if I hadn't done the podcast for 3 years, I would have had no clue. And even then, it was brain breaking to work an actual route. Not okay, we're just going to skip 20 years and arrive at somewhere where things have got a bit different, but actually start today
Hmm.
and walk us forward in a way that feels like it could happen to something that we'd actually want. And that I nobody's doing that. Oh,
Mhm.
at least Kim Stanley Robinson did something approximating, but in many, many ways it was very different. So I just wanted to give writers that data. So you came and spoke on that for me. Thank you. Spoke on the podcast. Thank you. Um, and in between, as part of this work, I did a master's in regenerative economics in 2016 um, at Schumacher, which
Mhm.
is a part of the Dartington Institute. And as a result of that, my partner and I moved to this, what was then quite well, anyway, it's a small holding. It took a lot of work. And now we've got 28 acres. Do you deal in acres in Canada or are you a hectare person?
And we're still acres. I think
Okay,
probably
that's good.
officially we're hectares, but
Okay.
but
Yeah,
I'm
I
I'm
still
an acre girl.
can't get my head around hectares. So 28 acres that we're endeavoring to farm regeneratively as much as anything as a model to local farmers of what it can be. So that's more or less it. Still lead Thrutopia, still lead Accidental Gods, which is endeavoring to give people tools to get closer to conscious evolution, to connect to the web of life. And I am handing over the dreaming teaching to my senior apprentice, which is very good.
Oh wow.
So that's more or less me. I used to be a veterinary surgeon. In your world, it's veterinarian. So that's where I started. It moved
Oh,
a long way.
there's lots of places I want to run down there, especially the dreaming. But let's put a little pin in that because I know it's going to come
We'll
up
get there. Yeah.
in where we might go. And I'll just transparently declare that my reason for wanting to have this conversation is that well, as you mentioned, I had the honor of being on your podcast and sharing thoughts with your Thrutopia Masterclass, and that really sort of whet my appetite for the kind of conversations you're opening up. And I feel like
Thank you.
opening is the key word. Like,
Hmm.
when somebody shares an idea or puts something in front of you and you just feel your chest expanding, like you just feel worlds opening up, which I
Yeah.
find such an energizing, encouraging, literally like gives me courage sense, versus the contrary, where you find yourself kind of shrinking and getting small and tight. So I feel like your podcast, your Thrutopia work, really sort of opened my senses in a way that I'd been thirsting for without quite realizing it. And then
Hmm.
I
Thank you.
started to read your Boudica series, and it was
Thank
like
you.
my thirst is slaked. Like it is so
Thank you.
incredibly well, there's so much I could say. I'll just probably just embarrass myself as a fangirl if I say too much. But that feeling of learning and appreciating and enjoying made me want to talk to you even more and spend a bit of time going into the backstage of that series and
Sure.
understand some of the nuts and bolts and then some of the themes a little bit more, since I have this, chance to chat with you and you're open to it. So that's
Sure.
kind of what led me here. And I wondered if we could just start in the writer's craft zone, if you will, and hear what led you to write the series, or and without giving too much away, what are these books I'm talking about, and just a bit of an intro on the series, if you will.
Okay. So I will try and keep this concise, but if I look like I'm running over, just do a kind of time signal because
No worries. There can't be
it's
too much on this, I don't think.
so we are very, very briefly going to go back to when I was 9 years old. Because at that point, two things happened. And one is I read a book called The Eagle of the Ninth by a woman called Rosemary Sutcliffe, which when I say this in the UK, half the audience goes, "Oh, yeah." But they're the older half of the audience because she was writing, I think she was born in the 20s, and I think the book was written in the 60s. And it was, I think we would now call it a young adult novel or a coming of age novel of a young man, a young Roman man. I think his name is Marcus, but I can't, to be honest, remember, whose father was legate, I think, of the Ninth Legion in the UK. And according to the book, the Legion lost its eagle. And this was a terrible thing. I later wrote a book called The Eagle of the Twelfth, so I had to really look into this. But essentially, a legion was 5,000 people. If there were 4,999 left, but they'd lost the eagle, the legion was disbanded, and these men were spread out. It's like a regimental colours. There are stories in the Scottish English Wars and in the Civil War where somebody would wrap the regimental colours around their body, put a coat on, and play dead on the field in order to get the regimental colours safely off the field. And that was an incredibly risky thing to do. You were much more likely to get your throat cut than anything else. And so the eagle was the same for the legions. It really was the spiritual heart of the legion. And so in this story, and again, the reciprocal of that is there's one man left in the eagle, they will form the legion. So the eagle has been lost. He gets together with his British tribal slave, whose name I do remember because he's called Eska, and he rides a chariot. I mean, there's so many anachronisms in this book, it doesn't bear thinking about. And reading it again as an adult, it was so sexist. But anyway, it was written by a woman who was born in the 20s, who was the daughter of a naval commander. We can't complain. But what happened was that Marcus and Eska go from somewhere deep in England up past Hadrian's Wall, which was then the boundary between what we think of as England and what we now think of as Scotland. And they came somewhere up to somewhere in the Highlands. And I'm a Scottish child reading this, Highlands of Scotland. And they find the tribe that they believe has the eagle. And it's the tribe of the Seal people. And the priests of the horned moon god are pretty nasty to Marcus and Eska. And they go into their longhouse-ish equivalent, and the goatskin curtain comes down, and they do something with the eagle that they have got, which is they're using, and you have no idea what's going on in the dark there. You never see it. And I read that as a kid, and very soon after, my dad took my brother and I to things called the Brochs, which are prehistoric monuments on the west coast of the Highlands of Scotland, so very near where all this was supposed to be taking place. He took us to the one at Glenelg, which is opposite Skye, and so Skye was big in my childhood. And the Brochs are, I think they're about 50-foot diameter. They're quite big, and they were shaped like a beehive. I'll do it like that, beehive. But they were double skinned, and down at the bottom there was 7 foot between the inner wall and the outer wall, and then it narrowed as it went up, and there were 7 stories. And in the bottom space, or maybe there's 7 stories and 12 foot. Anyway, it's quite big down below. The cattle were in below in the winter, and then there'd be a thing that was both a floor and a ceiling, and then there'd be hay, and then there'd be grain, and then there'd be people. Or people and then hay and grain, probably. Oh no, the people were on the inside. Sorry, they stored things on the way up. Anyway, these are very ancient, 3,000-4,000-year-old monuments. Now monuments, but they were homesteads. And my brother and my dad are wandering around talking about geology and archaeology, and I just stood there feeling the ghosts of my ancestors, or the spirit. It just did something really fundamental to the textures of my body. I could almost but not quite hear them. And I came from having read The Eagle of the Ninth and being desperate to know what happened behind the goatskin curtain with the priest of the horn moon god. And then I stood in this place and thought, you all around me, you were here. And really the whole of the rest of my life and that was a very long time ago, has been trying to work out what could have happened. And really, I mean, in basic terms, to connect with the gods of this land in a way that 2,000 years of Roman occupation, because in my eyes, we're still at the end of the Roman Empire, that, we're in the dying days of the Roman Empire. The whole predatory capital system came to Britain with Rome. And my belief then, and still is if I can connect to the gods of this land in the way that I was opened up to me. I lived in a little Presbyterian village in south of Glasgow most of the time, and then the rest of the time in Skye, which was wee free, which is even scarier. And this wasn't a thing, and nobody had explained to me that there were other gods until Rosemary Sutcliffe opened up this world of, oh God, there are real gods, actual gods of this land that people knew how to talk to, and I just have to learn how, and then the world will be okay. So that really, then I went off to be a vet. But while I was being a vet student, I was a vet student in Glasgow, and I spent most of my spare time going through to Edinburgh to work with a Druidic group that I had somehow found out. This is in the days before the internet. Goodness, I can't remember how I found them. And we do meditations in the caves at Roslin Chapel, and I spent loads of time meditating in the hills up around Glenelg, just really trying to make the space. So I was already, having had that space opened up, there were beginning, and this was in the 80s, beginning to be people who were also interested in that. And then I qualified, went down to Cambridge, and again, late 80s, there was a guy called Leo Rutherford. There was a very short window in the mid to late 80s when the Native American, First Peoples of Native America, their gods told them to teach the white people, because otherwise they were going to destroy the world. And there was this 5 or 6 year window where they were quite happily particularly coming to the UK, as far as I was concerned, and leading sweat lodges, teaching us stuff and going, this is how you connect to the gods, go talk to your gods. We're giving you the tools, use them. And then about 5 years after that, people started holding courses, give us $1,000 and we'll teach you to be a shaman in a weekend, or I'm going to write the book about how my grandmother's seventh daughter had all access to all this wisdom, and they just went, no, guys, you're not safe, I'm sorry. And the door didn't completely close, but it wasn't as open as it had been. But in those 5 years, I was being a vet, but every spare weekend, or I think every New Year for like 5 years in a row, I was doing sweat lodges at a place in Devon with people like Wallace Black Elk and the second Wallace Black Elk. So because we didn't have in the UK a lineage, the Romans did destroy them. Whoever, I have lots of friends now who are part of the Druidic movement in Britain, and a few of them still pretend there's a lineage, and I'm really sorry there isn't. 2,000 years of Romanization and Christianization, there just isn't. But there are people in your country where there is a living lineage. And those tools are the tools. This is the oldest spirituality of humanity. We spent for 300,000 years of our evolution, it's only really the last 2 in the UK where this has not been our spirituality, and a lot less, 500 years in your bit of land. So I think this is the birthright of humanity. And my experience is that if you step into that space and go, guys, I'm really sorry we've been gone, but we're here now, the sense of relief and welcome is overwhelming. Yeah. And I also think now, if we don't listen to this, basically we're screwed. I think it is possible for people of our culture to learn how to connect with the web of life in order to ask, what do you want of me? And hear answers that are authentic and act on them in real time. But it does take a lot of work. That's what I'm trying to teach people now. And that's what I think I wasn't as aware of that when I started to write the Boudica book. So I haven't forgotten your original question. So I was a vet in Cambridge, then I became a specialist in horses, and then I became a specialist in horse neonatal intensive care. It was getting more and more and more specialized. But then at the same time, I was doing all this other stuff and realizing in the end that the 2 paths, I had thought I could live in 2 worlds. And in the end, it began to become clear that I couldn't. And but I didn't know anything else that I could do to actually earn money and pay the mortgage and do all the kind of, stuff of capitalism. And so because I'd spent my childhood reading books, I thought I'll just write a book. That's what everybody does. And if I haven't got any other training, I'll just write a novel. And nobody told me that it wasn't going to work, for which I'm very grateful. Now I know, hundreds of thousands of people write books and less than 1% in those days, get published. Now you can self-publish. So I wrote a book. But the first things I wrote were contemporary crime novels because I didn't have the time to do any research, really. And I was just still doing the shamanic work, and it was basically I'm very good. No, I'm not. I take that sentence back. I'm actually very bad, and definitely I was then very bad. But there are times when I listen to what I'm told. And the instruction at that point was write this kind of stuff. And it's like, really? I don't read this sort of stuff. Well, read some and then write it. Okay. And I got 4 books into that. I was like so lucky. The first one was shortlisted for the Orange Prize, which is like the big women's prize in the UK. It's like that. I didn't know that wasn't what happened to everybody. I was still being a vet. Wow. I kind of walked into work and went, "Hey guys, I've been shortlisted for the Orange." And they're like, "Oh, okay, well done. We've got 6, cruciate ligaments on the list for today. Can you just do something with the first one we need on the table?" And that was the extent of anybody's interest. Wow. They thought writing was this kind of slightly weird hobby somewhere below stamp collecting and train spotting. And and so you got and so if there was a prize for train spotting, this was as relevant as that to the people I worked with. So we got 4 into that, and I was walking along. I had by then got myself a dog, yes, because I'd started to work a little bit part-time, and she was a lurcher. Do we know what lurchers are? I thought not. There was a while when my back cover bio said Manda Scott lives in Suffolk with 2 lurchers and too many cats, which I thought was funny and clever, until I found out that my American editors thought that a lurcher was a kind of homeless bloke.
Yeah, it sounds similar to lurker, which somebody just lurks. And
right, there you go. Yes.
But let's see what it really is.
You don't understand my lifestyle. So lurcher is a very old. In Britain, it was when the Normans came. So when feudalism was imposed after 1066 in the Battle of Hastings, it was illegal for anyone beneath the rank of baron to own a hunting dog, on penalty of being hanged, basically. And your dog would be lawed, which is to say they cut off its inner front 2 toes so it couldn't turn fast. And so what they did was they crossed the running dogs with the herding dogs. So you got something that looked a bit like a collie. And in those days, collies are just shaggy dogs, but it could run very fast. And they could hunt rabbits while still technically herding your cattle. So it's a very old crossbreed. And I had spent 10 years in the veterinary industry watching the destruction that the Kennel Club wreaks on inbred pedigree dogs, and I'm never having a pedigree dog in my life. I have just put down my old working cocker who was a Kennel Club dog. But anyway, I wanted hybrids, so I had a lurcher, and I had 2, in fact. And the lead one had gone after a hare, and I hadn't really thought anything of it because she wasn't that fast. Actually, she wasn't very good at hare hunting, which is what they were for. And she came back with it. So, oh, well, you got it, well done. But it turned out that it was in milk. It was lactating, so it had young. And I was walking through Newmarket Heath. The grass was, waist height, and the young then would be in forms in the grass, lying very still. And she's gone, and they're not. So basically, hares are sacred in the old pantheon of Britain. And not only was she dead, and I had no problem with my hunting dog hunting hares. If the hares, that's a good cycle. I don't care. But babies, if I couldn't find them, they were going to die. And the grass was this long, and they're trained to lie very still and not move. And I'm sending both dogs out going, if you touch it when you find it, I'll be very cross, but I want you to find these for me. And they're going, okay, Mum, sorry, we didn't mean to upset you. But they didn't find them. They're not scent hounds. They just didn't. They're gaze hounds. If nothing moves, they don't see it. So what I always say when I get to this point in the story, because this is one I've told a few times, is one learns quite early in this process that the gods will whisper, and then they will speak, and then they will shout. And if you get to the point where they're shouting at you, you're going to wish you'd listened a couple of steps down the line. And as far as I'm concerned, this was very, very close to a shout, because this is something that is sacred to the gods that I serve is dead. And I felt culpable because I'd been walking along thinking about the sequel to the book I'd just written and not really paying attention to the dog. And there's a point when I could have stopped her. And then after that, that point is gone. We could get into dog training. I'm learning dog training, but I think now that wouldn't be the case. But anyway, this many years ago, that was the case. So I went off and did a vision quest, which is something that I'd been taught. And near where I lived, there was a forest that had some old growth still left in it. And there was a hazel tree that literally I couldn't have wrapped my arms around if I'd even tried. And I sat under that and I held the question, what do you want to be? Which is what I teach my students, is that's the simplest. It doesn't presume anything. You're just holding open. And very quickly the answer came to write the story of Boudica. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about who she is. But partly I had promised that I would do this in ceremony, but I'd always had a kind of internal code of it was going to be when I was a good enough writer. And that's always at least 5 more books away, because it felt big. Yeah. And what I said when I was sitting there is, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not trained in anything except veterinary. I know nothing about this person other than the end of the Boudican revolt was the end of the Druidic time in Britain. That's when the Romans came and wiped everything out. And so this was our shamanic past. But I'm a vet. I don't know anything about this. And I don't even know how to find out. So I spent a lot longer in my vision quest than I needed to, because I kept going, no, that's not, that can't be it. I'm projecting, or my ego's getting in the way, or, this isn't it. And in the end, it was, obviously. And I made a deal. I teach my students, I did so many things that I would teach my students now never to do. But I did this, okay, I will go home. I'd had just enough money from something that I'd sold. One of the previous books, I'd sold the German rights, and I'd got an amount of money, and it was just enough to keep me afloat. This was spring of 2000, and I reckoned I had about 3 months left. And then I was going to have to go back to work full time. And so I'll do the research. And if there's enough, I'll do it. And if there's not, I'm going back to the tree and we're going to have the conversation again. And I went home and phoned a friend, like you do. And there was only one person I knew who wrote historical stuff that I thought I could pick up the phone to. And I picked up the phone to this person and said, okay, so I want to write about Boudica. What do you think? And they said, no, you can't do that. Your publishers will never let you, because you're changing brand. And they've got you. The previous book had just been shortlisted for the Edgar. You're on the trajectory. You have to stay on that trajectory. They will not let you move. And anyway, you can't write about Boudica, because if there was enough to write about Boudica, I would already have done it, and I haven't, so there isn't.
Oh. Yeah, that's encouraging.
Well, but I just promised under the tree, and you don't, things that you learned quite early on is you make a promise, you keep it. Otherwise, you're really going to be unhappy. And anyway, I wanted to. It felt like once you've made that promise, it's like, this is what my life is for. So I was really, really lucky in that I worked at Cambridge. And so I had access to the Cambridge University Library, which is a copyright library. So I had access to the classics library, the anthropology library, the archaeology library, the anything I wanted library. And I just spent the next couple of months in there. And what I learned was there was so much stuff. Mm-hmm. And why this person had never written it is utterly beyond me. But nobody had. I looked at it. Anyone who'd written anything had written a recitation of Tacitus, who writes about events that span 6 months at the time of the revolt. Nobody had written from the invasion to the revolt, which is like 20 years. Nobody had even looked at that. So why not? Why are we all so Roman-centric that we're only interested in what this Roman historian wrote? And I started looking into it, and in the end, I had a 23-page synopsis. And normally my synopses, I don't, any of your listeners who are writers, normally it's a paragraph.
It's a blurb.
And it says, it's a tiny bit of blurb. And then everybody knows that it won't be the blurb anyway, because by the time you started writing it, it'll evolve. But I had to prove to myself, and potentially I thought my publisher, that there was enough here to write And then I started thinking, this is a book. Oh, actually, this is a trilogy. Okay, look, 3 books. So I went to my agent, who was not the agent I have now. She was a wonderful woman, and she was really good. And she said, "You have to write what you have to write. You know, you're right. The existing publishers are probably not going to like this," and they really didn't. We went to them, and they offered what, even to me then, and I wasn't being paid a huge amount of money. There was a risable amount of money. And I knew I was going to have to give up the day job. There was no way I could write all of this while still working full time. I needed to be, it was a whole different level of stuff. So I'm nearly at the end, I promise. But the bit that really I think is worth getting to is, once you've made that commitment, there is support. Because I went to something called Crime Scene 2000. So this is the year 2000. It's a big crime conference in London. I've been writing crime novels, and I sit on a stage with 3 other people, and somebody, God love them, in the audience goes, "What are you writing next?" Which is every writer's favorite question, because the book that you're talking about is the one I wrote 18 months ago, because the publishing cycle just takes flipping forever, and I've forgotten all about that. And actually what I'm writing now is far more interesting. And so they asked, "What are you writing next?" And my editor, the one who'd offered the risable amount of money, was in the audience. So genuinely, just to piss her off, I said, "Well, I'm writing the life of Boudica, and it's going to be really different because nobody's ever written it from this perspective. And I really want to know who we were before the Romans came, because I think that's really important that we understand that." And everybody else looked at me like, "That's not a crime novel." And I'm going, "Well, it is actually, because I think the Roman invasion of Britain was the biggest crime ever perpetuated against our country." And they're all going, "But the Romans gave us roads." No, I think we had the roads before the Romans came. Thank you. And it did really piss off my editor, to the extent that by then that relationship was basically gone. But then 3 months later, in September, that was June, then September. So I just went home and started writing, and I was very nearly at the end of the money, and starting to look at jobs that would have killed it, stone dead. And I went to another crime conference, a whole week-long thing called Dead on Deansgate. And I came down off my panel there, and this person I'd never met before walked up to me and said, "I was in the audience at Crime Scene 2000. How are you getting on with Boudica?" And I went, "Well, I've got 3 chapters now, and I've got this 23-page synopsis. It's really weird." And she went, "Good, send it to me, because I've just got a new job at Transworld, and they want me to take on a really big series, and I think we'd like the world rights."
Wow.
And so I phoned my agent and went, "I'm going to send it to you now, and you're going to send it to this person." And she became my new editor. And she got it. She was Irish, and she got the dreaming. And when it became obvious that it wasn't just 3 books, it was 4, she persuaded the rest of the team. We decided in the end, between us, she and I, that the world was divided into Romans and Celts, and that she worked for a lot of Romans, but we could, and really interestingly, on the way through, there'd be some things where I go, we're not doing this, and she'd go, "We have to pick the battles, and this isn't one we're going to win, but there are battles we will win." And one of them was the covers. And I had a really clear idea what they wanted the covers to be, and she went, "Okay." And she went armed into the meeting, and she came out and she phoned me and she said, "Okay, your gods are still with us, because you wanted covers based on how they had just redone the Lord of the Rings covers into this beautiful, really striking new solid color with a decal on and really good font. You wanted that. The guy who designed those has just moved to our company, and he was in the meeting, and he would really like to do Boudica."
Wow. Oh,
so that, I mean, and then she was there for the whole, and then the Rome series, which came after, which has got some of the surviving characters in it. So yeah, so that was, sorry, it was quite a long answer, but you didn't do the tea thing.
Brilliant. It's brilliant. And even though I want to dive into the dreaming a little bit, but just before we go there, I want, if possible, to go a little further into how the books came to be. And with this, because I'm mindful of spoiler alerts, and then at the same time, they're about history, and anybody who wants to know what happens, they can, pop onto Wikipedia. But you have, well, just to back up, like, why am I here having this conversation with you? On the one hand, I'm aware that, some Romans came along and changed the landscape. I'm of Scottish descent, so I've got a sort of personal stake in the history. But if I'm honest, I couldn't be more ignorant of the details if I tried. I'm aware there were different tribes, different languages. Romans came, built some roads, changed some stuff. Here we are.
What did the Romans ever do for us?
I could probably pull some dates out if I tried, but so I'm wondering
Most
if
people
you
couldn't.
could, yeah, I probably get a few of them wrong. Um, and to be even more candid and perhaps embarrass myself further, I would say, although I don't like this to be true, I think it is true that until really giving myself permission to go there in my mind, I've probably been on the tourist side of the journey. And what I mean by that is, so what sparked me to want to have this conversation with you is that I feel like what you help us see and experience through this series is actually very important to our moment in time now, where a lot of people are saying, the way the industrial and current economic model works is quite harmful. Your Thrutopia journey that you shared in your opening remarks, and many others doing really interesting things around the world, are really highlighting the need to apply a different mindset to our economic norms, to find ways
Yeah.
to look after ourselves and our, the earth that is our home, to paraphrase Penelope Maver, who does some interesting chatter on this as well.
Mm.
And so that's my day job. I've been immersed in that
Yes,
conversation
and
for a
haven't you
couple
just?
decades. And
Yeah.
it's been my work. And yet, other than a kind of vague, intuitive curiosity, I hadn't really crossed over into looking deeply into history and how it has shaped the present. I'd say the last 2, maybe 4 years, if I'm generous, but for sure 2 years, I've tried to go deeper into the sort of decolonial journey.
Mm.
And there's lots more I can bookmark on that. But again, that feels fairly recent. That feels like it's connected to the genocides of the so-called New
In the
World,
Americas, yeah.
right? And again, tons of ignorance there and lots more for me to unpack. But when I've thought about, like, the word druid, for example, it's been as a kind of historical tourist with a sort of
Mm.
vague interest in pottery, not really grasping the degree to which those are my origins and
Yeah.
our shared origins that include all kinds of things that really matter to where we are in this economic and sort of industrial moment that is my day-to-day concern. And
Yeah.
so when I cracked the spine of Dreaming the Eagle, the first, and I was 2 paragraphs in when I was just flooded with goosebumps going, this is all connected. And things started to just open up in all kinds of crazy ways. And the dreamscapes, well, again, we'll hold the dream thing. So if you could, for those others who might be almost as ignorant as me, although that's a very low bar to try to stoop to, and without giving away too much, if you could just kind of take that 23-page synopsis and bundle it up for anybody paying attention here. What are these amazing books that I'm talking about? What's the story?
What's the story? Thank you. Okay, and don't be hard on yourself because I didn't know.
Hmm.
We get taught Boudica at school, at primary school, but you get taught it. We get taught it in the context of the nice, kind, benevolent Romans came and civilized Britain, which was previously in the grip of hide-wearing savages who communicated in grunts and whistles and spent their lives murdering each other, and we got Pax Romana and everything was fine after that. Literally, that's what we were taught. And unless I go into primary schools now, which I do sometimes, I take my sword and my stuff and go and show them stuff. That's what they're still being taught. Not exactly, because I've actually have some people who went to study archaeology at university having read the books, and so there is a wave now. It's yes, of people are kind of in the same way that there's an anti-orthodox economic movement. There's an anti-orthodox historical archaeological movement, but and I don't claim to have sparked that, but I think I just rode on the wave of it. So the first thing to put in context, somebody wonderful wrote to me last week to say that she worked with women who had successfully in Britain gained asylum, refugees. Often they'd been very badly sexually abused. They were often victims of torture, and that she would talk to them about their myths, and she would talk to them about the myths of Britain. And one of the myths she gave them was the myth of Boudica, because it was a woman who'd been powerful. And she said, several of them said, but how do you know this person exists? And perhaps their story is in fact a story of several people put together, which I have to say is one of the more intelligent questions I've ever had. And so there's a really, we need to look a little bit about what history is and how we know what we believe. Somebody
Mhm.
did ask me, a bloke stood up in a meeting in one of these book events that you do way back, just after the first book came out, and he said, "Well, how do you know she wasn't a man? What evidence do we have?" And I said, "Well, there's more evidence than there is for Christ by several orders of magnitude, and so, you know, I'll give you the evidence that I think we have." So let's have a look. I think it's worth looking at historicity in history.
Mhm.
First thing is, if I described yesterday to you, my life yesterday, it's not accurate. It's my perception of it, and every single psychological study ever done is that we see things through particular lenses, and our reporting of things that happened in our past is not accurate.
Mhm.
It never is. And there's a wonderful quote that I used to be able to do verbatim, and I can't now, but it's Kipling's son was killed at the Battle of Loos in the First World War, and he went round the survivors and he asked them what had happened, and he said every single one, with absolute veracity and their best intentions possible, gave him a completely different account of what had happened. Because you do
Mhm.
it, because your vision is different, and so we end up thinking that there are historical facts, and there are very few historical facts, but there are historical pegs that we can put in the board. So the
Mhm.
Romans definitely did come to Britain. That is a historical fact. The
Mhm.
detail of how they exactly got here is a bit flakier, but there's stuff that we can put together. So in terms of something that happened 2000 years ago, we have a number of things. We have written histories, which almost universally are written by the winners,
Mhm.
except the Vikings. In Britain, the only time history was written by the losers was when the Vikings came. But that's a separate story. So history is written by the winners. It tends to be written specifically Roman history. So most of what we have for the Boudican era is from a guy called Tacitus, who was the son-in-law of a guy called Agricola, who was part of the Roman army. He was a junior legate a junior tribune, sorry, when they came over in the invasion. He was one of the senior commanders of one of the legions by the time of the revolt, and then later he became the governor of Britain. And then he went back to Rome, and then he's telling stories to his round the dinner table, which is what you do in Roman times. And Tacitus writes it all down. And so it's a reasonable eyewitness account. It's better than the only other bit we have is from a guy called Dio Cassius, who was 300 years later. It's definitely not an eyewitness account, but
Mhm.
he's probably just rehashing Tacitus. It looks a lot like that and giving it some spin of his own. So mostly it's Tacitus. It's as accurate as you can expect to get from someone who's looking through a very specifically patriarchal Roman imperial lens at people he considers to be savages. But Tacitus isn't actually that bad. He's quite interesting in that he quite often gives his characters anti-imperial views. So there's a very famous speech from a man called Calgacus, whose name means the swordsman, so it's a title, not a name. And he's talking about the Battle of Mons Graupius, which happened in Scotland a little bit later. And Tacitus gives him a very famous speech where he said they wrought a desolation and called it peace, which is a really good definition of colonialism. And so, Tacitus isn't happy with the fact that that's happening. He doesn't expect the victims of that to be happy with it either. But mostly, it seems, I read that, first of all, not all of Tacitus' books survive. And so there's quite a lot of gaps, but we're very lucky in that the ones in which he mentions Britain, or at least the ones that we have, are ones in which he mentions Britain. It may well be that the ones that are missing, he mentioned Britain too, but we don't know. But they mention it in quite a lot of detail, and he spreads over the whole time from the invasion in 43 to the rebellion in 60-61. And before and after. So we've got Tacitus. We've got a bunch of other people who's mentioned stuff around it. So Suetonius wrote the lives of the first 7 Caesars, and that occurred. The invasion occurred, and the rebellion occurred in the middle of that. So he refers to it tangentially. And we've got a number of other people mention things in writing that we still have. We have coins. Numismatology is a really strong thing, because if somebody puts something relevant on a coin, it's stamped in metal that survives. We've got monuments where people chisel things that, again, can be quite relevant because they chisel what matters to them at the time. And then we've got actual archaeology of, for instance, Tacitus talks about the fact that during the Boudican revolt, there were three major cities. There was Camalodunum, which we now call Colchester, which was the capital. Then there was Londinium, and then there was Verulamium, which is now St Albans. London and Verulamium were burned to the ground, and there is a layer of ash in both of those cities. That otherwise we would have no idea. Was there some kind of firestorm? Was there a volcano? We wouldn't know what had caused it, but we can link it up with Tacitus and go, this is at exactly, you've got coins left in the middle of this, so it was definitely, after those coins were minted. It can't have been before those coins were minted. So you can do certain amounts of evidence of absence is not absence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but you can still reasonably go, okay, there was something quite big and it was at the same time in both cities, so something big happened. And so you can begin to go, okay, he wasn't just writing total fiction. And there's you can begin to build up pictures with someone like Caesar. So I think this is a really interesting parallel. With Caesar, we have Caesar's own writing. We have things written about Caesar by his contemporaries. We have coins with Caesar's face on. We have busts of Caesar. We have monuments that he ordered to be made, and we have monuments that were made about him after his death. And we have a history of Rome which gets to, it was an empire and then became a republic. And those things definitely happened. We could argue about the minutiae of who said what to whom, but that political event undoubtedly happened. So we have huge amounts of evidence relating to Caesar that backs it all up. One of my very early teachers said the exciting thing about Caesar is working out why he was lying in his stuff. So when people write stuff, they're writing propaganda. He's writing propaganda that gets taken back to Rome, gets read aloud in people's sitting rooms in the evenings, and it's designed to create a certain political impact. But that's frankly what all writing is for. So, but if he says I ordered my cavalry X and they went further than I wanted, and I signaled them good luck because it was impossible to call them back. You get, that's probably true because that's actually is how cavalry behave. Everyone is incredibly impressed with Oliver Cromwell that there were times in the Civil War where his cavalry went down and he signaled them to turn around and come back, and they actually did it. It's like, whoa, how did he do that? Because most times, once your horses are going and you're all after the guys and you can see them running, you are not going to stop. It doesn't matter what the trumpets are saying behind you. You don't really actually hear them. But he had guys who would turn around and come back. Caesar didn't, but that's okay. And he talks about things like the ciphers that he used. He used a letter substitution cipher to send messages. And we know that that was a thing at the time. And he's not making that up. Right. He may not have said exactly what he said, but he didn't write about using a letter substitution cipher that he wasn't using, because you don't do that. That's not a thing. Right. So you can get to quite a lot of stuff that is probably not exactly accurate, but is giving you a feel for the time. So in all of that, we have people writing about the tribes of the time, but no writing from the tribes themselves. We know that they could write Greek and Roman, but they very carefully chose not to write down their belief system. And I operate the same. I try not to let people, or I don't write down stuff about what I'm teaching my students, because if I go under a bus tomorrow, they will be killing each other over the second sentence and the semicolon in the third paragraph by the end of next year, because that's what people do. They stop living the stuff and they start reading the book. So not writing stuff is really sensible, but we know quite a lot. We know an amount about how the Druids were from lots of different writers. For instance, Herodotus tells us that people would go from all over the known world, which is basically Europe and a bits of Asia at that point, to Mona, which is what we now call Anglesey, the little island off Wales, to study for between 12 and 20 years. And then they would go back to their tribes and take what they'd learned back with them. And when I was beginning to really work with this, I worked for a little while with Elliot Cowan, who wrote a book called Plant Spirit Medicine, whose main teacher was a guy called Don Lupe. And Don Lupe offered a number of us to be apprentices. And it was 12 years. And the rule was we would have to go to Mexico and you'd have to give up all your relationships or take your partner with you. How likely is that? You know, no concept of how the West works at all. And and if you were still alive at the end of the apprenticeship, you had passed, but there was no guarantee of a very high pass rate. And it's still 12 to 20 years. Wow. So these things don't change that much. And so we can begin to build up a picture. So what we have with Britain is, and the other thing that was just beginning to grow at the time when I was getting interested was living archaeology. So there's a place in Hampshire called the Butser Iron Age Farm where they begin to build roundhouses. And they had about 4 iterations of, well, we know the post holes, we find post holes, and we kind of know that there was a fire in the middle, and we think it would look like this. Oh, that doesn't work, it fell down. Oh, that doesn't work. Putting a hole in the top really doesn't work, you get very wet. God, they had thatch all the way, and then the smoke goes up and it infiltrates through the thatch, and then that kills all the fire. That's really interesting. So Butser was beginning to do that. To the point where I could go and talk to them about it. And they said, for instance, things like, we know Caesar tried to come to Britain a century before the actual invasion. And he was coming for 7 things: grain, horses, dogs, lead, silver, gold, slaves. Lead, silver, gold, Wales, Cornwall, slaves everywhere. Hunting hounds and horses, particularly the east, and grain, because Britain was one of the most productive areas outside of Egypt in the whole of the Roman Empire. And it was more productive, the southeast of England was more productive in terms of growing grain at that point. And then the Romans came and destroyed the tribal system, but it was more productive before the Romans came than at any point until after the end of the Second World War, which is when we started the process of turning oil into food. Because it was incredibly labor intensive. That's what they found at Butser, is basically, if you're going to grow that much stuff, every single able-bodied individual over the age of 5 is out doing the growing, weeding or hoeing or planting or whatever, which then we can begin to infer. So when I was a kid, we were taught that the tribes were barbarians who spent all their time slaughtering each other, and the nice, kind, civilized Romans came and imposed peace. And I talked to the guys at Butser, and it's like, so everybody's in the fields? They're going, yeah. I'm going, what about this killing each other stuff? And he goes, well, they can't be, because if you're busy, if your warriors are raiding the next guy, and some of them die, you're dead. You know, if everybody's raiding everybody else, nobody's planting. Either you're all guarding the people who are actually doing the planting against the warriors, or you're out raiding the next ones. You're not going to be growing this amount of stuff. You're just not. It's just not actually a logistical possibility. So that's bollocks for starters. But we know, or at least we were told, that this was a warrior culture. And it seems likely because one of the laws that Tacitus talks about is that very quickly after the Roman invasion, it was illegal, on pain of crucifixion, to own a weapon. It was also illegal to be a singer, which is what they thought, or a singer or a soothsayer, which is what they called the Druids. So we have a warrior culture, I think, and I think it's likely then that there's a brilliant set of books called Tuyo by Rachel Neumeier. Have you come across them? Oh, you'd love them. Wait till you finish this, you'd love it. She's fantastic. It's a fantasy series, and it's a really interesting tribal versus a more westernized, Romanized. Anyway, it's interesting. I think that what we had was very likely, if you look at the Irish sagas, because they stayed not Romanized much longer than we did, so we can infer bits of how Druidic lore might have been from the early Irish sagas. And there was a lot of single combat. And you would go to a warrior school, and the warrior school in Ireland, when Cuchulainn wanted to learn how to really fight well, he went to the warrior school led by a woman called Scatha, who was a woman. The warrior schools were led by the women, or that warrior school was led by that woman. And nobody in the sagas goes, oh, wow, that was a school led by a woman. It's just that's where he went to learn how to be the best warrior he could. And single combat was a thing. So I think it is likely that single combat was a thing, and swords would pass down the generations until the Romans made them destroy them all. And so a sword would be a sacred thing. It would carry, I think, Yeah, I've got, hang on, so 2 seconds, I'm going to get you my sword to show you. Um, so I used to do battle reenactment. God, my hair, I've had a hat on all day. Used to do battle reenactments in my youth, and because I'm little, I had to make my own sword. So this is my battle sword, and it's actually a Romano-Celtic sword, so it's a bit more Romanized than it would have been, but it's the right weight, and it's hand and a half, so I can use it two-handed, or I can use it single-handed if I need to, if I've got a shield on my other hand. And I made this sword myself, and I love it. It's a battle reenactment. There was no danger of me ever dying, but my amygdala didn't know that. You're on a battlefield and somebody's coming at you with an axe, you think you're going to die if you don't do something about it. And the fact that you're sitting around the fire drinking beer with this guy last night, and you will be again tonight, is somewhere in the very, 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 very back of your limbic system, and the rest of you is expletive deletive, I'm going to die. And this sword has saved my life on many occasions, and I love it. So I think your sword becomes something really important. And actually, one of the wonderful things about writing the Boudica series was that I got to go, again, living history. Someone had just set up an Iron Age forge, and I went to learn how to make a sword.
Wow.
I got to go and learn how to drive horses. I found this amazing book in the Cambridge Library of horse bronzes from Boudican times, and they were beautiful. And so I get on. This was very early days of the internet, where it was still dial-up, and there was a BritArch alt group, and I got into BritArch and go, okay, guys, I'm writing this book, horse bronzes, horse bronze harness mounts. What do you do with them? And 3 professors of archaeology come back and go, you mount them on harness, little girl. I have 3 postgraduate degrees. Okay, so I want to know where you mount them on the harness and what you do with them. And they went, oh, we don't know about that.
Nice.
So but a guy got in contact and went, I'm on the BritArch list, and I drive my own horse, and I'm in Norfolk. You want to come play? Like, oh, do I want to come play? Yes, I really do. So let me bring my book, or actually the photocopies, because it's a book from the library. And here's your horse, because he said a horse hasn't changed shape much. There's a limited number of ways you can put stuff around it that it'll pull something. Let's work out what they could be used for. I had to cut that bit of the book. I cut a lot of work from Boudica because it wasn't, my editor said it didn't take us forward in the plot. But anyway, I got to know it, and it was good fun. So we know that the Romans invaded. We know that there were 4 legions. Well, we don't, but we can, Tacitus tells us there were 4 legions, and then there is reason to believe him. There's a lot of debate as to where they landed. One of the more interesting things, because after a while I'm going to archaeological conferences, and everyone goes, what are you doing here? You're new. And I'm going, well, I'm writing the book about Boudica. And they go, either I'm writing the novel about Boudica, or my wife is writing the novel about Boudica. And you go, oh, okay, so when's her deadline? And they look at you, deadline? I go, how long has she been writing it? Oh, 15 years? Okay, so I have to hand in by January, so don't worry, there's plenty of room. Look at how many books there are about Arthur. There's plenty of space for it to be another one, but I'm writing this one now. And then they'd get to, people would sidle up to me and go, you're going to have them landing in Kent, aren't you? Like, I don't know. And someone else would come out and go, you're going to have them landing in Maidstone, aren't you? Or no, it was Isle of Wight, aren't you? It's like,
the Roman landing lobbyists.
Yeah. And then I'd start getting the emails in all caps, or the letters in those days in purple writing on green paper, the other way around. It's like, what is this? And then a website went up, and it was a website of a conference at which I discovered then reading it. So there's obviously 2 sets of people, the ones who thought the Romans came up from Kent and in, and the ones who thought they landed at the Isle of Wight and rode up from there, because we know that the first battle was near the Thames, near London. And a guy got up on a stage. This used to be on the internet. You used to be able to look at this. And he's a professor, and he goes, so I know that the Romans landed at this point here at Kent because there's a monument there. My father took me to see it when I was 5.
Nice.
And I went to look at this monument, and it's cast in concrete.
Very ancient.
I think it's been there since 1954. And it's like, you're a professor of archaeology. Please tell me that was a joke. But these guys are not joking. I was getting really quite serious. You have to have our version. And so what I did in the end was I don't know if you have it in Kent, but you can get rolls of wallpaper lining stuff. It's basically blank paper in big rolls. And I had a little cottage in just outside Newmarket. I spread it all over the floor, and I drew a scale model, a scale map of the English coast and the French coast and the coast of Europe, and the Channel and the currents, and then I made little boats, and I had it such that, you know, the hole punchy things that make
Oh yeah.
make,
Yeah.
and half of one of those was a boat.
Okay.
Um, and they tell us that, you know, we know roughly that the really big boats the Romans had could get maybe 50 horses on, but they didn't. They commandeered a lot of little fishing boats because they didn't have those. They were off with the navy, and they couldn't get, Claudius couldn't commandeer the navy for them for some reason. And so we've got 4 legions of 5,000 men. We had, I think, 7 wings of cavalry. I can't remember the exact amount, plus all the siege engines, plus all the extras. And so I worked out what was the minimum number of boats. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was many times more than the Armada. And it was many times more than the Dunkirk landings. And the Dunkirk landings, which is where they went in the Second World War to rescue the soldiers and bring them back, took place over several days.
Mhm.
And they didn't all land in one place. And what I found very quickly was it was logistical impossibility to land all of these boats in one place on one tide. It physically, there wasn't room. And even over several tides, it wasn't going to happen. So what I thought in the end, because there were two, one was round the bottom corner of England and in, and the other was coming to the shelter of the Isle of Wight, which is just off the south coast, where there was a pro-Roman tribal leader. So the ones who were the Isle of Wight was, well, we'd obviously land where we were going to be welcomed. And the other ones were, no, we needed the shock troops up the side to get into London fast because we knew that the tribes were coming down to meet us. And so in the end, I thought, probably both. You bring the horses in to a place where you can get them off the boats and give them food and water, because you cannot bring a horse off a boat that's just done the crossing across the channel, get on it and expect it to be able to carry you anywhere. You just can't. I'm a horse vet. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. And you bring the shock troops in up the side, and you get them up fast to where you need them to be. And then I discovered a paper in an issue of Britannia, which was the journal of the time, called, that's right, Sentius Saturninus and the Invasion of Britain. And somebody had done some fantastic epigraphic work of monuments and statements about Sentius Saturninus, and decided that he had led the 9th Legion all the way up to York and landed at York and marched it down south, because the 9th was always associated with York. It was stationed there for the whole of the Roman occupation of Britain, because they didn't, in fact, lose the eagle. That was one of the things about Rosemary Sutcliffe. It hadn't gone. And I got to my editor and went, oh, look, I've got this paper. The 9th came in at York. I could write. And she went, how many extra words is that? And I go, I don't know, 20,000? No, you can't do it. Wow. I go, but it won't be accurate. She, I don't care. Nobody will know. I will know. He said, no, you can't do it. We've already cut 80,000 words from this book, and it's already way too long. You cannot put in another 20,000. So I never got to put that in. But I know that they did. They did. That was where the 9th came. Anyway, so there we are. That's that kind of stuff. It was so exciting after a while. I discovered was this uncovering, because people no one had sat down and they all had their theory, but they hadn't actually sat down and tried to imagine loading up a boat and sailing it over.
Yeah, and seeing what actually happens.
And seeing, where does the tide take you? Where are you going to land? You know, is it actually physically possible to do this? There was a whole bunch of stuff like that. So anyway, so we know the Romans invaded. We know that they got a foothold. The tribes the tribes united, and the battle, the big battle, lasted over 2 days, which was huge in the ancient world. I had a book for a while called Transformative Battles of the Ancient World or something. Most of the battles that have changed the course of Western history lasted a couple of hours, because having done battle reenactment,
right, yeah,
it's, you know, and I wasn't underfed and having walked for 3 days in the rain and having nowhere to sleep, and I would get back to work on a Monday morning. I remember vividly one Monday morning we had an emergency colic, and I had to hand it over to the guy who was basically my subaltern, because I couldn't think. Yeah. My brain just wouldn't function. This horse's vitals were doing weird stuff, and it's like, actually, my brain is just so fused from 2 days of fighting that I can't think, and you're going to have to do this for me or this horse is going to die. So most battles were really quite short and quite brutal. And this one took 2 whole days, partly because there's a great big fuck off river in the way. And if they hadn't managed to persuade someone to show them the way across upriver to come down and do a pincer movement on the tribes, we would have won and we'd have thrown the Romans out at the start. But we didn't. But then we had 2 decades of being a country under occupation where there was a consistent and continuous insurrection that the Romans were putting down extremely nastily. They were vicious. They were savage, and they destroyed. They did their best to destroy, but they didn't succeed because in 60-61 the revolt arose and again came within a whisker of winning. And again, if we'd thrown it out, I did write a short story, which is in the end of the first of the Rome books, called The Last Roman in Britain, of an alternative history of what might have happened if we had actually won, how the world would have been different.
Oh, wow.
A very different place.
Oh my gosh. There's so much in here. You've offered a tantalizing journey into the level of thinking, research, knowledge, detail in the series, and then a teaser for what comes next in your writing. It's tempting to spend more time in here, but I want to actually get into the dreaming. So let me just set this up a little bit. First, I'll just kind of reflect back at, I have a hint of like the what you just described in the last few minutes underscores what I'm experiencing as I'm reading, in that I feel like I'm reading a documentary. I feel like I'm in a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional documentary journey, not even film. And as I've been reading, I'm like, how, for the most part, I'm just captivated. Who is this Boudica and who are these people and what's going to happen to Bond? Don't tell me. But when my mind gives me a moment to, like, if when I get up to refresh my tea and I'm back in my real, this current present
reality,
I then go, how did she do that? It is so accurate as far as my mind can say. And as you say, we don't really know what happened, and there's ways to know. So I would bundle up what's happening as I read it to say, I'm being taken on a journey through time and place from multiple angles that explain both my own personal origins as a white settler in Canada and our economic origins. And I have never read historical fiction. I am the last person in the world to read about battle scenes. I think I'm the only person I know who hasn't read or seen The Lord of the Rings. This is kind of not my genre.
Okay.
And yet I feel like you've grabbed me by the hand and you're like, I know. And it's complicated history and there's lots of details and there's all kinds of things. Trust me, come anyway. Like it's just been this incredible journey. And one of the things that is most captivating for me, so practically anybody who's ever met me has heard me talk about my dreams. I have been a lucid dreamer since I didn't even know what lucid dreaming was. I've been an active rememberer of my dreams. Sometimes they're very, very vivid, and very connected to something that ends up happening or is happening or people in my world. And sometimes they're just the little, funny little fragments that the mind serves up. And what I've been noticing is when we talk about lucid dreaming, and I'm sure most people listening are familiar with that term, I feel like what you're doing is it's kind of lucid writing, where you're sort of giving us multiple layers of truth in one go that has so many places you could sit with. I'm curious if you can tell us a bit more about the role of dreaming, just kind of pull on that red thread a little. And it's of course something that's still active in your day-to-day life. So take us on a journey into why dreaming is in this book and why it matters.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all of that. And this question, because this is the core of everything, really. So we talked about it arising from the vision quest. So what I was told sitting under the tree, there were a number of things. One is this will change the world. And I really believed it. After the first book was written, I went around the country going, this is who we were, this is who we could be. We just need to let go of the Romanization. And in the end, it has changed a number. I get still, it's 20 years on, I get emails every week from people going, this has changed my world. But it changed my world. I started teaching the dreaming, and you have to understand something in much more depth if you're going to teach it. So it completely transformed my world. And one of the other things was to make the dreaming real. Every bit of dreaming in the first book, I had to have either done or seen done. By the second book, I had to tweak that a little bit. I was given a bit of license. There's one thing that happens that I had heard of but not seen. But fundamentally, this is, yes, it's set 2,000 years ago, but it has to be something that is possible now. So the books arose out of my dreaming. They arose out of me having made a commitment in ceremony to write about our shamanic past, and then to the event with the hair. And so my process of dreaming, my process of writing, at the time, so I would have labeled myself a fire dreamer. We can look at what that means at some point, but I would sit with the fire every evening. I lived on my own, and I got rid of all my sound systems. I don't like music anyway, but I got rid of the television, got rid of the sound systems. I sat with the fire every night with the dogs, me and the cats, and did the work with the fire. And then I'd go out for a walk in Thetford Forest, which was near, I lived in East Anglia, which was where the Iceni were. So I was in the right land, and I would walk for 3 or 4 hours, processing what the fire had done. I'd come home and I'd write for the rest of the day. I'd write till about 10 o'clock at night, and then I'd sit with the fire again. And I did that pretty much without break for 6 years. I became very strange. My friends would, I remember vividly one, I don't know, some point in the day, and a friend phoned up, and I picked up the phone, old days, actual phones, and said hello. And that was the only word I said. And she said, "Oh, you're writing, I'll call you back later." So, what did I say? And she said, "No, it's fine, you're busy." Okay, fine, click. And periodically, a particular number of friends would go, "You need to come out. You just haven't touched reality." And I'm going, "I'm fine with reality." And go, "No, you don't understand. You're really not." And they would be right. Yeah, I was in a very different space, and my world is very different. Let's not. The comparisons are irrelevant, but it was definitely a very different space to anything I had ever been in. And the only time I really went away was when I went off to do other training with other people. And then after the first book, I began to teach. And again, you have to know what you're doing. So what I would say now is that these books were written 20 years ago, and my understanding of the dreaming has deepened beyond all recognition. So what I wrote then is what I believe to be true then. I'm not sure I would write significantly different now, but I might write it slightly differently. But then also my writing has evolved. That's probably not a useful track to go. But so what I was doing was, particularly with the first book. So the first book leads from the childhood of the woman who became the Boudica, because Boudica means Budag was bringer of victory. So it's she who brings victory. And I thought, like Calgacus, swordsman, it's extremely unlikely that somebody names their child that who happens to grow up to destroy the Ninth Legion and burn Colchester to the ground. That's probably not a thing. So this is a title. And I explained this to my editor, and she goes, "Well, she has to get it in the first book, right? You can't wait until the first book for that. No one's going to understand that." Also, I wanted to call it it's Boudega in current writing. And she went, "No, you can't do that. It's enough. In archaeology, it's Boudica has 1 C. Tacitus wrote it with 2 C's. And then somewhere the Victorians changed that to Boadicea. And it works much better. If I had a whiteboard, I would do it. But if you draw out for your, actually, let me just do this, because this is quite interesting. I shall see if we can see this on the screen. So Tacitus was just listening to his father-in-law. Can you see? So that's Boudica. It's probably backwards, is it?
Written the way it is. No, it's not backwards. And it's
okay. Good.
My memory is correct. It's written the way it is in the current book version, but there's an extra C in what you're showing.
Yes, there's an extra C. But if you turn the U into an A and the second C into an E, you get Boadicea. It's a so if you've got monks in cells writing by not very good candlelight, it's basically a misprint.
Right.
But so when I was a kid, she was Boadicea. Wow. And for a lot of people still, she's I still, more than anything else, when I was going around, I would have the people going, "Why is she not Boadicea?" Because it's not right. It's, and even Boudica with 2 C's isn't right. And so all the archaeologists, the main book that at that point was the epigraph about her was Boudica with 1 C. So they I could get that past the. This is again one of these battles you're not going to win. Boudica is not going to happen. Boudica with one C you might get away with. Just settle for that.
Nice.
Okay. So the girl who was going to grow up to be that, I wanted to look at the height of the flowering of what even now archaeologists call the late pre-Roman Iron Age. It's like calling the whole of the First Nations America, the late pre-Columbian tribal era. It's beyond annoying.
Things like that are painfully common here too, but I follow. Yeah.
It makes my blood boil. But anyway, this for me, it was the height of our culture. When I was again doing the research, I went down to the British Museum and I got to know the guy who ran the kind of late pre-Roman Iron Age exhibit, and he had just had a guy come from China, and China at that point was thought to be the best metal workers in the world of that era. And this Chinese guy looked. There's a thing called the Mildenhall hoard, which was found at a place called Mildenhall, which is in East Anglia. It had all been buried, and it was a farmer dug it up when he was ploughing, and it's the most beautiful torques you can imagine. The torque was a thing that went round your neck, and these were hollow, crafted of gold. They were absolutely gorgeous. The big gold bangles, and I think gold was given because we found a lot of gold in rivers. It was given to the gods. I don't think it had any particular exchange value because money wasn't really a thing until the Romans came. But these things were gorgeous. And he said, first of all, it would have taken hundreds of craft hours to make these. And again, this is my mitigation of you're not thinking you're about to be raided by the neighboring. I used to be a silversmith. I used to have my own hallmark. It takes quite a lot of organization to have all your tools in the right place and everything. You're not bundling it all up and running away from a neighboring tribe every 5 minutes if you're doing this. And he said there was nothing to match this anywhere in the ancient world for another 1700 years after this. And the Romans destroyed that level of craftsmanship. So I wanted to show that level of craftsmanship or craftingship. And who we were, how a tribe could have functioned, because we lived in roundhouses. I did go and sleep in a roundhouse for a couple of weeks to see what it felt like. And so and it's a really different experience when you sleep with somewhere where there's 80 other people and you're around the fire and the dogs are there, and it's a really different experience. And I read a lot of anthropological studies of other tribal cultures to get a sense of how tribal life could be, because I thought it's really important that people understand this. And underpinning it all is the spirituality that we know from Herodotus and other people. The Druids were honored throughout the ancient world. But I didn't want to call them Druids because kind of like even in Britain, they've got this folk concept of people in things that look like Ku Klux Klan outfits at Stonehenge at summer. It's like chariots, no chariots, no Druids. We're just not having that. It's just too hackneyed and it's anachronistic. So, and the Romans had their crucifixion was for singers and soothsayers. And I thought, in the way that I was taught ways of practicing that don't involve plant medicines, so not taking drugs basically. And most of it is rhythmic drumming, but I worked with one teacher for whom dreaming was a really core part. And I thought that surely, if I can access the gods in my dreams, then it's been a thing for a long time. So I called what we would now call the Druids, our shamanic past, the dreamers, because it seemed to encompass, and there were the dreamers and the singers. And the singers would hold the lore and the dreamers would connect with the gods, because that's what Herodotus says. They learned their stuff. They went back to their tribes and they would bring the lore and the law, and they would connect with they would be the conduit between the gods and the people. And so I wanted this to be the core of their lives in the way it was the core of my lives, to show people in the West what it was like to live connected to the gods of this land. Because the Romans imposed their, new, young, strangely adolescent god on us. And why are we obsessed with a very, very new mythology of the Middle East when we could be learning the mythologies of our land and talking to the gods of our land? It's crazy. And and it wasn't something I ever wanted to do from being a child. Was forced to go to church until the day I could articulate to my parents and the minister why I wasn't going back. I was really lucky because when I could articulate that, I wasn't made to go back anymore. And so I wanted that to be in the world. And I had this idea that if I put it down in the first book, that people would learn the dreaming from the book and be able to do it. And what I discovered, I had this really strange experience of, after the book was published, I did a book tour because book tours were a thing in those days. They're not anymore. 3 weeks going all the way around Britain, starting and finishing more or less near Cambridge. And so 3 weeks later, I'd gone from Cambridge, I come back and people are lining up to get the book signed and going, I've seen you. You were here. And the first line, I've signed your book for you. You don't want me to sign it again. And they're going, yeah, we read it. And we still don't know how to do the dreaming. Okay? But it's all in there. And they're going, you might think so. Yeah, I do. And they no, definitely not. We don't get it. We don't know how to do it. Oh, bugger. So I went home and did the work. And yes, it seemed that me starting to teach was going to be something that was required. And I thought I would do 2 or 3 courses and that would be it. And 20 years later, I'm now handing over to my senior apprentice who's been with me. My longest standing ones, we've got 2 weekends from now, we've got a meeting, a 5-day meeting, and they have been with me for 20 years. The one who's teaching a bit less because I discovered I needed someone who knew how to teach and I would teach them the work rather than the other way around. But, and she's now, we had a call last night, I'm teaching 3 this year, she's teaching 11. So, and one day I'm going to hand them all over.
Yeah.
But it's been astonishing, really, that people want to learn and their lives change, which is what matters.
Can you break that down a bit for us? So, and I realize there's a risk of being that kind of linear, colonized Roman type by asking the question the way I'm about to ask it. So it just maybe is
Just
what
ask.
it is.
It doesn't matter. Yeah. No, ask what.
And yet I also think of myself as a dreamer. So there we are. What does it mean to teach dreaming, both sort of mechanically, what is meant, but then also what happens to a person for learning that? What's the transformation that you offer there?
Okay. So I'm using dreaming in a very broad sense to mean any way of, so one of the core teachings of shamanic practice, wherever it is in the world, if we assume that it's the indigenous spirituality of the forager hunter peoples of the world, and the core teaching is that this reality is a tiny fraction of all possible realities, and that it's possible to step into the infinite possibility of all other realities with training in order to ask for help. That's the absolute core. And so you're not just spacing out, you're going to a place that you can map out after a while, or you can map out bits of it, in order to ask for help, to bring help back to this reality. That's the point. The boundaries of this reality may not be what you thought they were. And I think one of the big learnings is to let go of how you think consensus reality works. And so I teach, there are a number of things that you need to know if you're going to do this safely. I'm a lot more paranoid about safety than most of my contemporaries, but let's assume that safety is a big thing. I contend that this is either the original spirituality of humanity. It's incredibly powerful, and we've had 300,000 years of developing it, and it takes a huge amount of focus, and it is utterly transformative of the world and people. Or you can learn it in a weekend. It cannot be both of those things. And we live in a culture where a lot of people want the weekend stuff. They actually nowadays, they just want to kind of pick up an app and switch it on, I think. And you can't. It takes a lot of time. And most of the time is learning to get out of your own way. So in order to do the asking for help, but you need to know how to move between the worlds. You need to know what kind of questions you can usefully ask and how to phrase them. You need to know what you might meet, and particularly how to differentiate between those things that come with our best and highest good and those things that are either just cruising around or actively seeking to harm. you need to know, once you've differentiated between those, you need to know how to ask the questions that you come with, how to hear the answers and how to bring the answers back and how to apply them. And you need to know also how to make sure that you definitely are back. So teaching involves really being very clear that those steps exist and that you can't miss any of them out, and providing a structure within which people can learn those things. And then dreaming itself is the practice of abandoning this reality and asking for help in the other realities. And that makes it sound both linear and binary, and obviously it's not. You read the books. There is a point when you let go enough of consensus reality that the boundaries of the world become porous and there's an osmotic flow. And so it becomes, in the beginning we teach drumming because it's safe and it works. We teach dreaming, which is harder, but drumming journey. So are you familiar with the drumming journey? Most people listening will be. So somebody drums and on that rhythm, which is a slightly fast heartbeat rhythm that will shift you from out of beta waves into alpha waves if it's done right. It's easier then, the drum is called the shaman's horse, it's easier to shift into what we would in Western terms call an altered state. The thing about journeys is it's quite hard to switch off our ego. So there is always a voice at the back of your mind going, you're just making this up. You're just doing this, you're seeing what you're seeing because you're afraid. You're either bringing in what you fear or what you hope for. And that voice, as far as I can tell, never goes away. It just sometimes gets to be a bit quiet. And some people are making it up. I think the thing that you have to do in teaching is holding people through the projection, because it's natural. And we live in a world where our left brain is this big and the rest of us is this big. And it's really hard to get that back into balance. Our dreams, by contrast, our egos are basically silent, but it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you can go into the dream space and hold your sense of self enough to know that you had a question you wanted to ask and where you might get the answers. And so what we're trying to teach over time is that our dreams become like our journeys and our journeys become like our dreams, in that we can hold focus in our dreams and we cannot be ego inundated in our journeys. And that just takes a lot of time and a lot of practice and a lot of testing stuff out. Because if you get stuff in a journey that you think might be your ego, but it might not be, the only way to know, I think, is to go out and real world test it. I was told to do this. If I do this, does my world get better? Then it doesn't matter if it was your ego. I think this is one of the key things that I get to. Everyone goes, well, how does this work? So I've got no clue how it works, but it's not my business to know how. It's my business to know how to make it work. If I want to waste internal bandwidth trying to find answers to stuff that I will never find the answer, I will probably develop a really coherent belief system and it will still be bollocks. And that's a total waste of time. So trying to get people through but I don't know how it works. You don't need to know how it works. You just need to know how to make it work. And for that, you need to put in the time and go out and road test it. This is, I used to practice evidence-based medicine and now I practice evidence-based spirituality, in that if it works, we do it again. And if you were telling yourself this stuff, it doesn't. There are whole branches of modern shamanic practice, contemporary Western shamanic practice, that are convinced that we're just accessing our own subconscious. And I think that they are wholly wrong, but I also think it doesn't matter. If the world becomes more coherent and flourishing and regenerative as a result of accessing some vast, amazing subconscious that you happen to be able to access, then that's fine. I don't care. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I got a bit ranty at the end there.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And you said something earlier, I was just checking my notes around and I don't think I got it quite right, because you talked about the textures. So I'm gonna mangle my words a little bit. You talked about the textures of our bodies, and out of context that doesn't make as much sense, but the way I held it was a sort of inner or internal texture in the context of the stories and the things we were talking about earlier. And I feel like when you talk about dreaming, this idea that like either people are willing to commit a lifetime of practice and learn, or they want it in a weekend. And, is it something we already have or something we have to cultivate? I feel like that for me bumps up against this notion of getting out of separation and
Yeah.
into interconnectedness. And so
Yeah.
if I say, well, I'm one individual, I'm just this, kind of meat body in this realm, and I have to decide what I do and don't have, and then go get more, then, or not get more, then it kind of does matter. Like, can I get it this weekend or not?
Yes.
Whereas if I say, well, yeah, okay, those are possibly useful questions to experiment with, but more useful is, what is my intention?
Mhm.
And where am
Yes.
I, what is
Yes.
my desired direction of travel? And as you and I know, because we've talked about this before in other channels, my intention, my belief is that our higher consciousness as a moment, I'm not even going to say as humanity, as a kind of ball of energy, is towards healing,
Mhm.
is towards wholeness, and
Yeah.
integrity, and all kinds of English words that get annoying, but they just feel good and have that expansiveness. And when I look at how industry is structured, which happens to be my language of training, I happen to have a weird amount of knowledge about apparel manufacturing and forestry and food and, lots of different
Yeah.
technical industrial practices. And to me, they look like it's the equivalent of, like, to have a good night's sleep, you need to take a sleeping pill. It's
Hmm.
like, no, actually, that's the definition of a bad night's sleep, but
Yeah.
you're surviving. And so what is it
Yeah.
when we take away that kind of boxed up, constrained model of good and bad, we let that
Mm.
go. And then we say, what does it feel like to sleep well? Oh, well, that's a
Mm.
whole different thing, right? And so we move
Yeah.
towards this
Yeah.
wholeness of being the way we're meant to be. That's a kind of fluffy way of saying, I actually do believe we have the potential, the knowledge, the ability to to dream the way you offer it in the stories, and the way you've clearly been kind of building on the expertise and potential over the decades. And I think we have the training to shut it out, to ignore it, to ridicule it, to disincentivize it, to think of it as a hobby, or maybe something we do on the weekend, but we definitely don't do it Monday to
Mm.
Friday.
Yeah.
And I then want to, like, blow up the notion of Monday to Friday. Like, that's a
Oh,
complete
quite. Yes.
fiction,
Whose idea was that?
right? Like, the
Yes.
sun is just laughing at us. She's like, what are you guys talking about? So anyway, that's a little bit of, like, a personal riffing on my end. I want to have this conversation for, like, the next forever. I'm aware of the
But you
time,
have to
and
go.
ironically, as we chatted about before, I have an appointment in the modern medical community that I have to
Yeah.
live
You have to
within the
go.
time space continuum and pretend that I believe in
Yeah. Yeah.
modern.
We do still occupy this. It's good. Yeah. We have
But
to move on.
but I'd love to hear, if in sort of closing remarks land, I mean, I want to hear everything now.
We
But
can always do another if you want.
yeah,
If people want.
I'm tempted to tee that up. But if you had to sort of, or if you could invite folks listening to have any kind of experience having entered into your work, perhaps Boudica, perhaps other books, what's the invitation you'd like to offer to readers?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Reframe for me.
Yeah, so there's a before and after.
Hmm.
Before, and
Okay.
let's
Yes.
just
Okay.
go
Yeah.
with
Makes
Boudica,
sense.
which kind of
Yes.
sparked this
Yes.
conversation.
Yes.
Before a person has read Boudica, and after,
And
if
after.
you could choose what has
Okay.
happened, what would you love to see being different?
Well, pretty much exactly what you said. An understanding that right out below the surface, outside the shimmering boundaries of the world that our Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic, weird society has taught us, is a richness beyond comprehension. That it is possible to fall in love with life and to feel connected to the web of life in a way that each of us knows our place in it, then where I can be what only I can be, when you can be what only you can be, to the best of your ability, connected to everything else, but fulfilling a really necessary part in that web, so that everything becomes more alive because you are taking a stand in your place, and that we can all still do this. And it does take work, but
Mm.
it is also incredibly self-reinforcing.
Mhm.
You know, once you've stepped over the first threshold wholeheartedly, you won't want to step back.
Yeah.
Also, small print at the bottom, you can't. Uh, so yeah, I do sometimes get people phoning me in tears, especially on the shamanic weekends, of like, you didn't tell me this was irreversible.
Oops.
We did actually, but we just didn't understand.
Mhm.
So and you can close it off if you really, really try. But once you've actively taken that step, I don't think you want to. And it's amazing. The world is full of stuff, what we would genuinely call magic. And it's awe-inspiring and it's glorious. And even as the old structures, the dying days of the Roman Empire crumbles around us, there is a web that is building what's coming next, and we can be part of that. Is that
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. It more than works. And it is beautiful work and it's great work. Manda Scott, thank you
thank you.
so much for your time, your genius, and everything you've offered to us. I am extremely grateful.
I am extremely grateful for you taking the time to read and then for taking the time to make this happen. Thank you. And for all that you're doing, because it really matters. You speak to the people who speak languages that I don't, who will never read Boudica. I don't think. And you can talk to them. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.